Welcome to the overview of Module 4. This module focuses on those last 7 steps in the selling process, right from the presentation phase all the way up to the post-sale follow-up and support. It is important to note that this overview, like all the other overviews, is not a substitute for reading the assigned chapters in each module. This overview of Module 4 covers the following areas. It starts with a brief introduction of the module itself. It will then list the chapters covered in this module. From there, we will look at the key learning objectives that are expected for each chapter in this module. We will then progress to talking about some of the salient points raised in the module, or what we call module highlights. And it concludes with any readings, assignments, assessments related to this module. So Module 4 continues to explore the selling process. It goes beyond the initial steps of the selling process as discussed in Module 3. Module 4 explores the fundamental steps of the selling process that occur after the approach phase and all the way to the closing of the sale and post-sale follow-up and support. Within Module 4, you'll be able to discuss with the buyer your solution's features, advantages, and benefits, and describe your compelling value proposition. And the value proposition is very important. It's very key because it's a short, sweet, concise encapsulation of what it is you do, why it's important to your customer, and what makes you different from the other suppliers. You will explore the 5 main purposes of a sales presentation and how to incorporate the 6 key elements of the sales presentation mix to effectively connect with your audience. In Module 4, you will also learn how to skillfully handle a prospect's objections and resistance and how to negotiate with the customer to achieve win-win results. You'll also learn how to recognize buying signals and gain customer commitment to close using a variety of different closing techniques. What we'll find is it's really important when we get to the closing phase that we understand that we can read the buying signals that come from the customer. Rarely will a customer ever say to you, well, hey, I'm ready to buy, aren't you going to ask me the question? It's not that simple. So we have to be able to infer and read and be able to really analyze those implicit type of signals from the buyer, be they verbal and many times nonverbal, so that we know when the timing is right. If we time our close too quickly, we will come across as being overly aggressive. If we time our close too late, we may actually lose the sale. So we will also explore how important it is to conduct post-sale follow-up and support. Remember, to the customer, once the sale has been made, that's when the relationship is really starting for them. And that's where they really test our commitment to what it is we've promised. So we need to see it that way. We need to understand that what we do after the sale will be very important in securing whether we make the next sale. The chapters covered in Module 4 are as follows. Chapter 9 deals with the presentation and primarily the elements of an effective presentation. Chapter 10 deals with handling objections and the reason why we need to welcome our prospects' concerns or objections, as they're a window into their thinking and really give us an idea of the obstacles that we need to overcome in order to successfully conclude the sale. Chapter 11 is about closing and the sense that closing is really the beginning of the relationship. And chapter 12 deals with follow-up maintaining and strengthening the relationship after the sale. Now we're going to identify the key learning objectives by chapter for this module. So after studying this module, with regards to Chapter 9, you should be able to discuss the purpose and essential steps of the sales presentation. You should also be able to explore the 6 elements of the sales presentation mix and understand the importance of the trial close. Now, just an important note about the trial close, because you'll see it pop up in different stages of the selling process. A trial close is a very important tool in selling, and it's a very simple tool. It's basically a question that attempts to gauge how close you actually are to popping the closing question. So, as I indicated earlier, it's important for us to read buying signals so that we get an idea of whether now's the time to pop the closing question. And sometimes, no matter how experienced we are in sales, it may be difficult for us to gauge if now is exactly the right time for me to ask that question about closing. Even the most experienced salespeople sometimes have difficulty with that. So the trial close is all about asking a question that leads to the closing question. So, for example, let's say I thought I was ready to close. I'm seeing all the right buying signals. I'm hearing all the right things, but I'm just not quite sure yet if I should ask that question. So if I were to ask a trial close, it might go something like this. Well, Mr. Customer, it looks like we've made some great progress today. It seems like we've been able to address the issues and concerns that you've raised in the meeting. Tell me something, are there any reasons that you can see that would prevent us from doing business? When you ask a question like that, it basically, the answer, if it's positive, sets you up for the closing question. If it's negative, then it means that you still need a little bit more work. So in other words, if the customer answered that question, well, no, I think you've answered all my questions. I can't see any reason that would prevent us from doing business. Then the only question you can ask after that is the closing question. A question like, well then, Mr. Customer, if you would sign here, then we can start delivery next Tuesday. But if the customer were to answer that in a negative way, like, well, I'm not quite sure yet I'm ready to make a commitment. There's still a couple issues I have in my mind. Well, then now you know you got a little bit more work. You thought you were there. You thought you were ready to ask the close, but obviously there's something still working in the customer's mind that needs to be addressed. And it's a way to really diffuse any tension without, alienating the customer in any way. So that's what a trial close is. It's just a close to, it's basically a question to gauge if you're ready to really ask the closing question, how close you are to it. Some of the other elements of Chapter 9 key learning objectives are to identify the difficulties that may arise during a sales presentation and how to handle them. A lot of times during sales presentations, no matter how we prepare and how we plan for difficulties to arise, and they will. We can't always predict them all. But our job is to be as prepared as possible so that when we see difficulties, when we see certain things happening that could impact our effectiveness in that presentation, impact our message from being read or interpreted properly, then we need to have a plan on how to handle that. And that's really part of the Chapter 9 material. And the last point on Chapter 9 is to explain how to handle discussion of the competition. Because talk about the competition will come up in a presentation, and sometimes it's raised by the customer to gauge your own professionalism. They will gauge your professionalism in terms of how you speak of the competition. If you speak about them in a very negative and derogatory way, then it's unprofessional. And just think of it this way. Think of it when somebody's talking about a person who's not there to defend themselves. You tend to lose trust in that person. You tend to think, well, what are they saying about me when I'm not there? And it's the same thing when you denigrate the competition to gain some kind of advantage. It doesn't really work. So there are ways to talk about the competition in a professional manner and still get your points across about the relative effectiveness and superiority of your solution. Chapter 10, some of the key learning objectives there are as follows. We want to be able to explain why you should welcome objections, essentially what they are, and what to do about them when they arise. So we're going to see that we first have to recognize what an objection is. What are the sources of these objections? And then when they do arise, what do we do about them? And the right mental approach with objections is not to gloss them over, not to ignore them, not to hope that they won't come up, but to really flush them out, welcome them. Because the only way to get closer to your goal of making the sale is to make sure that you've overcome all the hurdles and obstacles that are in your way. You also want to explain the different categories of objections and where they arise so that we can identify them. You want to list the techniques for meeting the objections because there are different types of techniques. We'll see that there's some basic things we can apply to all objections, and then there are some things that are very specific to the particular objection that we can bring into play. And you also want to explain the process of negotiating and what it means to negotiate to achieve win-win outcomes. Because at the end of the day, whenever we are dealing with objections and negotiating with the customer, we always have to keep in mind the interests of the other party so that we're not making gains at their expense, so that we're not winning and they're losing. So we will look for ways in which we can actually create outcomes in which both parties feel that they've been able to address their own interests. And those form the basis of lasting relationships. In Chapter 11, we'll talk about closing, which is really gaining customer commitment. We'll recognize what it is, when to close, i.e. recognizing the buying signals, explains the various methods of closing, and there are several. And let's face it, we're not going to use all of these methods in our sales career. In fact, in my 35 years in the business, I've used probably 3, maybe 4 different closing methods, tops. We'll find that there are certain closing techniques that work well with our own personality and that we feel comfortable with and are effective, and we tend to stick with them. So you will find your own, and you will use those over any of the other ones. And we'll also discuss the 12 keys to successful closing. What do we need to keep in mind that will help us be more successful in closing? In Chapter 12, we want to understand the importance of customer satisfaction, retention, and engagement. We also want to explain why service and follow-up are vitally important to increasing sales. And another key learning objective of Chapter 12 is to list the 8 steps in increasing sales to your customer. The following are some key highlights of Chapter 9 in Module 4. So the sales presentation is a persuasive, vocal, and visual explanation of the business value proposition. And there are 4 common methods of sales presentations, ranging from the very simple memorized and formula methods to the more complicated interactive need satisfaction and problem-solving methods. Each method is effective if used in the proper situation. And very often, the difference between whether you're using a more simplistic presentation method, like the memorized or formula, versus the more complex methods, is really the degree of familiarity a customer may have with your product and technology. Also, the complexity of the solution itself, and also the degree to which the customer really understands what they need and can articulate it. There's a lot of situations where the customer may realize they have a problem, but they don't really understand what it is they need to solve that problem, because it's far-reaching and quite complex, and maybe they don't have the skills in-house to be able to determine exactly what it is they need. So in those kind of situations, we have to be a lot more engaged with the customer. We have to ask a lot more questions. We have to help the customer through the process of really articulating what it is they feel they need. So in those kind of situations, they're going to be more involved, and they're going to be more focused on problem solving versus a memorized or formula model, which is much more where the customer knows what they're looking for, they're familiar with the technology, and really are looking for what it is you can offer in that vein. In developing your presentation, you need to consider the elements of the sales presentation mix. So these are the elements that you're going to use to be able to get your message across in the clearest and most compelling way. And you have a lot of tools at your disposal. Think of the ways in which you can communicate your message in a presentation. You can use visuals. You can use a demonstration. You can use a dramatization. You can have the customer involved in part of the presentation. You can use charts and graphs and all of video. All of these are different tools, different elements that you can use to help get your message across in a clear and memorable way. And we'll be talking about these and a lot of other methods in this chapter. Another another highlight in this chapter is the need to always prepare for the unexpected. And this is going to happen. No matter, what do you think? There's going to be distractions, there may be some interruptions, there may be people going off on tangents, or somebody grandstanding and trying to control the presentation. We need to be able to expect these things and have a plan for how we're going to deal with them. And another element of this chapter is that understanding that the presentation is a key part of the overall sales process. It is the part of the process where now you get to speak and you get to state your case of why your solution is the one for the customer. And this is your chance to develop a desire and a bias for action for your solution. So you need to make sure that we are using all the components in the sales presentation mix to be able to bring our message to advantage. The following are some module highlights related to Chapter 10. As salespeople, we work hard to give customers reasons to buy our solution. So it is vitally important that when customers show an interest to buy, that we don't mislead them. Our responsibility is to be prepared and to respond logically and clearly to our prospects' objections whenever they arise. So while sales objections often indicate a prospect's opposition or resistance to some information or request by us as salespeople, they also reflect an interest on the part of the prospect. Let's face it, Customers that aren't interested don't take the time to raise objections. They're just simply indifferent to what it is we're talking about. They couldn't care less. So if somebody is interested, they may very well take the time to raise objections, because in their mind, those are the hurdles that need to be overcome in order for them to feel more comfortable with our proposed solution. So here are 4 steps in handling effectively handling objections. And this applies to just about any kind of objection you're going to get. We're going to see there are some strategies that are specific to specific types of objections, because there are different types of objections. But this 4-step strategy applies to virtually all objections. And it's very basic and it's very simple. Firstly, you want to listen to the objection. And you want to look as though you're listening. So not only listen, but look as though you're listening. So your body language, your eye contact, your facial expression has to be one of interest as well. And, you know, this allows us to kind of listen and acknowledge the buyer's viewpoint. Then you want to identify the problem and clarify the concern by rephrasing or summarizing the objection. So in other words, you may start with words like, well, if I understand you correctly, Mr. Customer, your issue is, or your concern is, ... And at that point, you are really just summarizing or rephrasing what they've just talked about. And this is important for a few reasons. One, it shows that you were listening. It's pretty hard to rephrase or summarize an objection if you didn't listen to it in the first place. And secondly, it's respect to the customer, because it shows that you have taken the time to blot everything else out of your mind in order to be able to listen clearly to what it is they're saying. And the other reason why this is important is because to put together an action plan to deal with their objection, you have to first understand fully what that objection is. I notice a lot of people, when they get defensive because they hear something they don't like to hear, they're automatically just kind of selectively hearing a word here and there, and they're automatically thinking about what it is they want to say next without really hearing out everything that the customer's saying. So we don't want to be in that kind of situation. We want to hear the customer out completely so we understand what they're saying. We rephrase it by sending it back to them and saying, is this what I just heard you say? And by doing that, we can confirm whether we do indeed understand what the issue is, and then we can put an action plan into place to address it. And that leads to point number 3. We want to meet the objection clearly and concisely. And then, where appropriate, we can actually use a trial close. For example, if we've already handled a lot of objections to this point, and now the objections are starting to become rather trivial, not very important anymore, we've handled all the big ones, you may at some point try to trial close on this. So in other words, you might say, well, Mr. Customer, is there anything else that we need to address to put this issue to bed? Or, well, Mr. Customer, have I answered all your questions? Because if the answer to that is favorable, yes, you have answered my questions, or yes, I think we've made a lot of progress, then that can lead to the ultimate question, which is the closing question. Well then, Mr. Customer, are we ready to proceed by signing the order? It's important to plan for objections and to be aware of the several techniques that we can use to overcome them. So again, planning is a word you hear that comes up a lot in sales. Planning for your call, planning your sales call objectives, planning this, planning that. And planning for objections is just another one of those things that we need to do. And you'll find that as you get more and more experience in your field, the type of objections you're going to get are going to be pretty predictable. When I was dealing with banks, I was dealing with different banks, but I was dealing with banks. It was remarkable how similar the objections were, and concerns were from bank A to bank B to bank C. Why? Because they're in the same business. They're all dealing with the same pressures and challenges. So it's not unusual that they're going to have very similar kinds of concerns. And you also want to welcome your prospects' objections, because don't see this as negative. See this as a window into their thinking and an obstacle that you need to overcome in order to get you that much closer to your goal, which is to close. Do not shun objections or ignore them, because the one that you ignore or shun could be the one that can kill the possibility of making a sale. So chapter 11 deals with closing. And closing is that process of helping prospects to make decisions that will benefit them. So while closing is physically the act of asking for the order and getting commitment, getting signature from the buyer, let's say, it can also be viewed as the end of a problem-solving exercise in which the customer has purchased your solution to address their needs. So the close of the sale is really the next logical sequence after your presentation. And think of the close as the start of the next business cycle, because once we close, we then have to live up to our commitments, we then have to support the customer, and that becomes our cue to kind of work on the next cycle of selling with the customer. Timing is really important when it comes to closing. That cannot be emphasized enough. So it's essential that we look for buying signals, both verbal and nonverbal. And the time to close really is anytime the prospect's ready. So it doesn't have to, it's not like you have to have so many meetings before you ask for the order. That request can come sooner in some cases if everything lines up and the customer is happy and they have an urgent need, or their need is such that they want to go through, or it can be longer depending on customers that have a lot of options, want to think things through, their decision-making cycles longer, and so on. So there's no set parameters, no set rule that says you need X number of meetings to initiate a close. That's going to be specific to the situation at hand and the customer. But it's important to be prepared to close at any time. So making sure you have the right documentation, you have the right pieces that you need to help you in that close. The last thing you want to do is delay a close because you don't have the right documentation or paperwork there with you. Because anytime you miss that chance to close when it could have been a really good opportunity, could be an opportunity to invite the competition in and create create problems for us. So if there's any doubt if now is the right time to close, and as we discussed earlier, we can initiate a trial close, which is really a question to gauge how close you are to actually popping the closing question. And while it is important for salespeople to plan and rehearse different closing techniques for different prospects, it's also important that the salesperson adopts closing techniques that are natural to them and makes them feel comfortable. So in other words, we will talk about in Chapter 11 various kinds of closing techniques. And they're all pretty effective in the right situation. And what I find is, like, with all these different closing techniques, you're never going to use them all. It's kind of like trying on clothing. There's all kinds of different styles and colors and, fabrics for shirts, for example. But there's, I'm not going to buy every different type of shirt just because there are different styles out there. I'm going to buy ones that suit me, suit my personality, ones I feel comfortable with, that type of thing. And it's the same with closing. There's all kinds of closing techniques out there, but I'm going to fit ones that I feel comfortable with based on my own personality, style, and approach. A good closer always has a strong desire to close the sale. And even though a lot of situations may arise where the first time you ask for the close, doesn't always mean you get the customer agreeing and signing on the dotted line. Sometimes you will get some objection or you'll get some rejection of that. And that's going to happen. That's just built, that's a natural, part of the selling process. But what's also important to note here is to not accept the first no when you hear it. Just because the customer says no or offers some kind of objection doesn't mean that we can't ask again. Now, that may mean is that we have to go back a little bit and backtrack and find out what's driving that resistance. Ask a few questions that, how do you feel about this? Was I able to answer this properly, Mr. Customer? Is there something here that's that I haven't addressed that we need to talk about? There could be all kinds of ways in which we can ask questions to kind of flush out that source of resistance so that then we can try again at some point to ask for the order. So don't accept that first no. Backtrack, retrench, go back, figure out the source of resistance, and then try again. So that type of persistence and determination can mean the great difference between success and failure in a sales career in general. Many times I have closed business well after that first no when I first asked. And if I only had taken that first no as being, the gospel, then I certainly would have missed a lot of selling opportunities down the road. The following are some highlights of Chapter 12 in Module 4. So salespeople can increase sales in a couple of key ways: by obtaining new customers and by selling more products to existing customers. And customer referrals are the key to finding new prospects. Therefore, it's important to provide excellent service and support to customers, because satisfied customers will refer other customers to you. And at the same point, by providing a high level of customer service, we can increase account penetration or increased sales to these customers because they're satisfied. And what we find is that satisfied customers tend to buy more products and provide more insights into how we can tap other divisions of their own company. To serve customers best, it's important to contact each customer regularly. Keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening in that account is crucial. So promptly handling complaints, always adhering to commitments, thanking customers for their business, no matter how large or small, is very important. This holds true even if customers begin to buy from a competitor. We shouldn't be defensive about that. We should, if the customer is starting to buy from a competitor, then we should try to find out why that's happening, but in a friendly, non-intrusive way, and work harder to earn or re-earn their trust. It's important to remember that the best way to help your customer is to help them to be successful in their business. So to do that, we need to understand their business. We need to speak their business language. We need to understand the pressures that they're working under. What are their challenges? What are their opportunities? What are some of the things that are happening or trends that are happening in their business that are either positive or negative? We really have to think of ourselves mentally as being on the same side of the table as them, not on opposite sides, where we can act as their business consultant, their trusted advisor, to help them gain competitive advantage. At that point, then, we're no longer seen as a seller or a provider of goods, but more as a business consultant. Today's professional has to be service-oriented. So following up on sales and following up by providing superior service and support will help maximize your sales and help you achieve your personal goals. This brings us to the conclusion of the overview of Module 4. At this point, I'd like to summarize the readings and assignments related to this module. We'll start with the readings. please read the chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 from your textbook. There are some supplementary readings associated with this module, and again, like all supplementary readings, they are recommended, but they're not mandatory. And they are as follows. First one is the value proposition. It's actually a video by In the Funnel Sales Consultant. There's also a worksheet that goes along with this video. It's entitled the Value Proposition Worksheet. It's also by In the Funnel Sales Consulting, and you'll see that in your assignments area. Another supplementary reading is the article entitled Leading Sales Through the COVID-19 Crisis, and it's by the Boston Consulting Group. It's an excellent article that kind of brings us up to the present day in terms of some of the challenges that sales leaders face today as a result of this pandemic. Another supplementary article is the article entitled Strategy and Tactics for Sales Professionals During the COVID-19 Crisis, and it's by S. Thigarajan of the Economic Times. Also associated with this module, I'd like you to view the PowerPoints on chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 from your text. As far as assignments go, there is a video exercise entitled Why Companies Hate Negotiating with Apple, and it's at the end of chapter 10. It's worth 3% of your grade. And again, you want to view the video, answer the questions, and submit them for marking. There's also another video exercise entitled Wells Fargo, and it's at the end of chapter 11, and that's also worth 3% of your grade. Again, view the video, answer the questions, and submit your answers. There's a case study at the end of chapter 9. It's case study 9.3, entitled Dumping Inventory. Should this be part of your presentation? And that's worth 5% of your grade. Again, review the case study, answer the questions, and submit your reply. Test number 2 is at the end of this module, and it covers modules 3 and 4, and it's taken during the week of class 12. And it's worth 20% of your grade, and it's performed online. So again, like all of these things, please consult your course calendar for actual date deadlines.